God's plan for Israel, every family had a home on the land with sufficient ground for tilling. Thus were provided both the means and the incentive for a useful, industrious, and self-supporting life. And no devising of men has ever improved upon that plan. To the world's departure from it is owing to a large degree the poverty and wretchedness that exists today. The physical surroundings in the cities are often a peril to health. The constant liability to contact with disease, the prevalence of foul air, impure water, impure food. The crowded, dark, unhealthful dwellings are some of the many evils to be met. It was not God's purpose that people should be crowded into cities, huddled together in terraces and tenements. It is Satan's purpose to attract men and women to the cities, and to gain his object, he invents every kind of novelty and amusement, every kind of excitement, and the cities of the earth today are becoming as were the cities before the flood. The Lord desires his people to move into the country, where they can settle on the land and raise their own fruit and vegetables, and where their children can be brought in direct contact with the works of God in nature. Take your families away from the cities is my message. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country, where they can raise their own provisions, for in the future the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. We should now begin to heed the instruction given us over and over again. Get out of the cities into rural districts where the houses are not crowded closely together, and where you will be free from the interference of enemies. There is a section entitled Rural Living. It reads, "Living in the country away from large centers of population is generally recognized as being advantageous for promoting physical, mental, and spiritual health and development. Because of this advantage, Seventh-day Adventists have endeavored, whenever possible, to establish their institutions outside metropolitan areas, and have encouraged church members with families to find homes in the country." So the SDA Encyclopedia starts off saying it's physically, mentally, and spiritually better to live in the country, and that the SDA Church has encouraged members with families to find homes in the country. The article continues, "The advantages of country living, together with the disadvantages of city living, are stressed repeatedly in the writings of Ellen White." The following quotation is typical of her views. "The world over, cities are becoming hotbeds of vice. On every hand are the sights and sounds of evil. Everywhere are enticements to sensuality and dissipation. The tide of corruption and crime is continually swelling. Every day brings the record of violence, robberies, murders, suicides, and crimes unnameable. It was not God's purpose that people should be crowded into cities, huddled together in terraces and tenements. In the beginning, he placed our first parents amidst the beautiful sights and sounds he desires us to rejoice in today. The more nearly we come into harmony with God's original plan, the more favorable will be our position to secure health of body and mind and soul. As early as 1890, SDA leaders were pointing out the advantages of country living. In an article entitled Rural versus City Life, appearing in the January 7th and 14th, 1890 issues of the Review and Herald, G.I. Butler, former president of the General Conference, pointed out the advantages of living close to nature and urged SDAs to live in the country. Here's an excerpt. "The present tendency of population is toward the cities. City growth is proportionately more rapid than that in rural sections. We feel certain that the great mass of those who leave the country for the city expecting to increase their real happiness thereby make a grave mistake. If such could realize the reality fully beforehand, they would never make the change. Cities have ever been and will ever be Satan's peculiar seat, just in the degree of their size and population, luxury, wealth, and pride. We do not see how anyone with the right views can love city life. We turn from it gladly to contemplate the quiet charms of country life. In part 2 of the article, nature presents her greatest charms in the country. God's works in nature are higher in every sense than man's arts can rival. Here children can be reared for God healthfully with greatest freedom from evil influences of ungodly associates. In rural life, there is a communion with nature, and through it with nature's God, attainable, which may greatly benefit those who live in the country far more readily than those in the city. They come near to the source of all things. A few years later, W. W. Prescott, an SDA educator and administrator, in an article in the Review and Herald, March 16, 1905, entitled Country and City, warned SDAs to resist the trend of moving to the metropolitan areas and pointed out that because of the corrupting influences of the cities, we are removing our institutions from the cities to the country. Here's an excerpt. Those who have read the history of Rome know that in the last days of the Republic, the people deserted the country and flocked to the city, and that consequently Rome was crowded with a rabble of poor citizens, largely fed at public expense. This was one of the conditions which made for the downfall of the Republic and opened the way for an imperial tyranny supported by a military despotism. The same inclination to shun the country and to abandon the cultivation of the soil for the excitements of the city is exhibited in this republic today. Some are able to perceive the meaning of this movement. The Conservative Church Standard says, one of the most dangerous social tendencies of the age is the drift of population from the country to the towns. It is more than simply a dangerous social tendency. It is part of a well-planned campaign arranged by the enemy of God and man, who is making ready for the final struggle. An article of the USAOnline.com entitled Urbanization of America states, the early United States was predominantly rural. According to the 1790 census, 95% of the population lived in the countryside. The 5% of Americans living in urban areas, places with more than 2,500 persons, lived mostly in small villages. Only Philadelphia, New York, and Boston had more than 15,000 inhabitants. The South was almost completely rural. After 1830, the urban areas of the country grew more rapidly than the rural areas. By 1890, industrialization had produced substantial growth in cities, and 35% of Americans lived in urban areas, mostly in the northern half of the United States. The South remained rural, except for New Orleans and a few smaller cities. The number of Americans living in cities did not surpass the number in rural areas until 1920. By the 1990s, 3 out of 4 Americans lived in an urban setting, and since World War II, the southern half of the country has become increasingly urbanized, particularly in Texas, Arizona, and the states along the eastern seaboard. Back to the SDA article on rural living. It states, between the 2 world wars, the idea of rural living was not particularly stressed. But during and especially after World War II, a movement was set afoot to encourage SDAs to leave cities and find country homes. It continues in 1942. F. M. Wilcox, longtime editor of the Review and Herald, wrote an editorial titled Leaving the Cities in the August 27th issue, in which he urged SDAs to leave the large cities and find homes in the country, but cautioned against rash, haphazard moves, particularly on the part of those who had no knowledge of farming. Should our readers with children living in large cities seek homes in the country? Many are considering this question today. Some undoubtedly should do this, others probably should not. It is with the hope that we can encourage one class to take this step and discourage the other class from doing so that we pen these words. The instruction for our people with children to leave the cities as far as they can consistently do so is very definite. In the General Conference Bulletin of April 6, 1903, we find this statement from the messenger of the Lord. Educate our people to get out of the cities into the country, where they can obtain a small piece of land and make a home for themselves and their children. For these and other reasons which might be given, we would say to those with families of small children, leave the large cities and find homes in the country, provided it is wise and best for you to do so. He goes on to say, consider now the other angle of the question. Some parents living in large cities are needed in the city churches of which they are members. They fill important church offices and they are carrying heavy responsibilities. For them to forsake their posts of duty and go away would entail heavy loss to the work of God. We cannot believe they should do this. They can determine their duty only by prayer for divine guidance and in counsel with responsible brethren. She said, there are reasons why we should not build in the cities. On these cities, God's judgments are soon to fall. The time is near when the large cities will be visited by the judgments of God. In a little while, these cities will be terribly shaken. No matter how large or how strong these buildings, no matter how many safeguards against fire may have been provided, let God touch these buildings, and in a few minutes or a few hours, they are in ruins. The ungodly cities of our world are to be swept away by the besom of destruction. In the calamities that are now befalling immense buildings and large portions of cities, God is showing us what will come upon the whole earth. Oh, that God's people had a sense of the impending destruction of thousands of cities now almost given to idolatry. The Lord calls for his people to locate away from the cities, for in such an hour as ye think not, fire and brimstone will be rained from heaven upon these cities. The time is near when large cities will be swept away, and all should be warned of these coming judgments. As a result, as the article says, the General Conference began to give serious consideration to setting up an organization for promoting rural living for SDAs. In December 1945, E.A. Sutherland, president of the Rural Education Association of Madison, Tennessee, was invited to become the secretary of a commission to be set up under the name of North American Commission for Self-Supporting Missionary Work, of which L.K. Dixon, president of the North American Division, was to be chairman. The commission was to begin functioning July 1, 1946. Among other objectives, this commission was to stand as a body of counselors to such individuals as would decide to locate their families in more rural communities and enter into some form of self-supporting missionary endeavor. It continues, probably early in 1946, a committee on country living was set up as indicated in Section 4 of the General Conference Action for March 14, 1946. In August of the same year, the General Conference recommended the merger of the North American Commission for Self-Supporting Missionary Work and the Committee on Country Living that had previously been set up to promote rural living. The new organization was named the Seventh-day Adventist Commission on Rural Living and had Sutherland as secretary and C.B. Haynes as assistant secretary. Among other objectives, this commission was to encourage our church members in cities to study the instruction from Ellen G. White about country living and to develop plans whereby they can fulfill this instruction. To provide counsel and information to those who are considering moving to the country. To hold regional institutes for self-supporting missionary workers and individuals interested in country living. Summarizing, in 1946, the General Conference recommended the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Commission on Rural Living, which would have three main objectives. 1. To encourage church members living in the cities to study the instruction on country living and also plan towards carrying out the instruction. 2. To provide counsel to those considering moving to the country. 3. To hold regional training institutes for self-supporting work and country living. In harmony with this section, the booklets Country Living and From City to Country Living were recommended to SDAs for reading. An article written in the Lake Union Herald on April 11, 1950 by Carlisle B. Haynes provides a great insight into the publishing history of these two books. For the past 5 years, there has been sounding out with renewed emphasis the call of God for His people to leave the cities and locate their homes in rural areas. This call has been given impressive force by the publication entitled Country Living. This is a compilation of the messages given by Ellen G. White from 1902 to 1906, containing counsel from heaven to stand apart from membership in labor unions and get away from the corruptions and dangers of the cities. To many Adventists, these statements were new. To others who had known of them, their republication in 1946 was clothed with a new significance. A deep impression was at once created throughout the churches that this renewed call was timely and demanded study and action. A remarkable interest was taken in this call to leave the cities. Indeed, for a time, some uneasiness was felt lest there should develop a mass movement and families might act on impulse without adequate and intelligent planning and business-like arrangement, and thus bring disaster and disappointment to themselves and to the cause. This, we are glad to say, has not occurred and ought not to occur. If the instruction regarding procedure accompanying the heavenly message is heeded, it will not occur. The profound interest taken by Adventists generally may be discerned when the circulation of country living is considered. It was thought by publishers that a printing of 5,000 copies would be ample to supply the unknown demand. Just before printing, this was increased to 10,000 copies, and that was the number of the first printing. This was completely exhausted within a few weeks, and a second printing of 10,000 copies became necessary. This was followed quickly by a third 10,000, then by a fourth and a fifth. At the present writing, between 50 and 60,000 copies of Country Living has been eagerly taken by the believers. The effect has been gratifying and impressive. There has been serious study followed by positive action. As families have found the way to do so, there has been a growing movement out of the cities to country locations. There have been careful plans, satisfactory and prudent arrangements, thorough inspection of new locations, close consultation with church and conference officers, and wisely executed management in the moves that have been made. Only in a very small number of instances has a hasty or indiscreet move resulted in consequences that have been regretted. This is the way the whole enterprise should continue to develop. And it is to help in this and to answer as helpfully as possible the many questions to which any such movement gives rise that now a companion pamphlet to Country Living is published. It is called From City to Country Living. It is the purpose of the new pamphlet to present such general guiding principles as will be of service to Seventh-day Adventists in considering the steps which will eventually lead them to a home location more in harmony with God's ideal. The pages of this companion pamphlet have been prepared for the purpose of answering questions that have arisen helping families to make their important decisions with wisdom and discretion, safeguarding them from costly mistakes and cautioning them against exploitation. The new pamphlet is priced at 25 cents and should be ordered from your book and Bible house. It contains the following chapters: The Call to Leave the Cities, What is Country, Reasons for Moving to the Country, God's Promise to Help Families to Secure Homes in the Country, Choosing a Location for a Home in the Country, Gardening and Other Activities, Life at its Best, The Lure of the Land, Enterprises Operated for the Lord versus Worldly Enterprises, Learn to be Self-Sustaining. So we see that 50 to 60,000 copies of the book Country Living were received by the church by 1950. This is an impressive number, but to put this in true perspective, the membership of the SDA Church in 1950 was 756,812. 50,000 books received means that 6% of the church, or 1 out of every 15 Seventh-day Adventists, had the book Country Living in their possession. So the message of Country Living would have been well known within the Adventist Church. Country Living is a small book with only 32 pages. You can read this in one day. Chapter 1 is entitled A Call to Leave the Cities. Some of the subsections are The Perils of the Cities, City Living Not God's Plan, Cities to be Visited by God's Judgments, Imminence of God's Judgments, Peril to Those Who Remain Unnecessarily. Here are some highlights. In choosing their surroundings, few make their spiritual prosperity the first consideration. The world over, cities are becoming hotbeds of vice. On every hand are the sights and sounds of evil. Life in the cities is false and artificial. The physical surroundings in the cities are often a peril to health. The constant liability to contact with disease, the prevalence of foul air, impure water, impure food, the crowded, dark, unhealthful dwellings are some of the many evils to be met. It was not God's purpose that people should be crowded into cities, huddled together in terraces and tenements. Continuing with highlights, it says, I was pleading with some families to avail themselves of God's appointed means and get away from the cities to save their children. The same voice that warned Lot to leave Sodom bids us, come out from among them, and be ye separate, and touch not the unclean. Those who obey this warning will find a refuge. The time is near when the large cities will be visited by the judgments of God. In harmony with the light given me, I am urging people to come out from the great centers of population. Our cities are increasing in wickedness, and it is becoming more and more evident that those who remain in them unnecessarily do so at the peril of their soul's salvation. Chapter 3 is entitled An Appeal to Parents. There is a subtitle, Christian Qualities Better Gained in Retired Locations. It says, there is not one family in 100 who will be improved physically, mentally, or spiritually by residing in the city. Faith, hope, love, happiness can far better be gained in retired places where there are fields and hills and trees. Take your children away from the sights and sounds of the city, away from the rattle and din of streetcars and teams, and their minds will become more healthy. It will be found easier to bring home to their hearts the truth of the Word of God. Send the children to schools located in the city where every phase of temptation is waiting to attract and demoralize them, and the work of character building is tenfold harder for both parents and children.